Injured bear approaches hikers. When they saw what was in its mouth, they were shocked. The towering pines of Yellowstone National Park swayed gently under the golden afternoon light, their emerald canopies rustling with the whispers of a cool breeze. Clara Morgan inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the crisp, earthy scent of the wilderness surrounding her. The world pulsed with life, the distant bugle of an elk, the chatter of birds flitting through the branches, the rhythmic crunch of boots on the winding dirt trail. She had always found solace here, immersed in nature's raw, untamed beauty. It was why she had dedicated her life to conservation, to ensure that places like this remained untouched for generations to come. Her companions, a group of close friends from college, were a mix of experienced hikers and weekend adventurers. Michael, the most cautious among them, adjusted the straps of his backpack for the third time in an hour, his gaze flickering nervously toward the dense underbrush flanking the trail. "I swear I just heard something," he muttered, falling into step beside Clara. "Something big." Clara smiled, brushing a stray lock of auburn hair from her face. "Relax, Mike. It's probably just a deer." She gestured at the untouched expanse around them. "We're in their home, remember? Nothing here wants trouble with us." Despite her reassurance, the rustling persisted, growing louder, more erratic. The group slowed, their chatter fading into wary silence. Clara's pulse quickened, her trained eyes scanning the trees for movement. Then, a sound that sent a ripple of unease through them, heavy, labored breathing, just beyond the bend in the trail. Clara raised a hand, signaling for caution. With careful steps, she edged forward, heart hammering in her chest. As she rounded the corner, her breath caught in her throat. A massive grizzly bear emerged from the underbrush, its golden brown fur matted with dirt and blood. Its dark eyes were heavy with exhaustion. The bear limped, favoring one of its front paws, its breath ragged and uneven. But what held Clara frozen wasn't the bear's size or its injuries. It was what she carried. A cub, small and motionless, hung from her jaws. The sight sent a jolt of sorrow through Clara. The little one's body was limp, its tiny limbs dangling, its fur caked in dried blood, a lifeless offering. Behind her, Michael sucked in a sharp breath. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." But Clara didn't move. She barely breathed. The mother bear wasn't acting aggressively. There was no warning growl, no defensive charge. Instead, she simply stood there, her massive frame heaving, her amber eyes locking onto Clara's with something that sent a shiver down her spine. An emotion she hadn't expected to see in a predator's gaze: desperation. Clara knew enough about animal behavior to recognize the anomaly. This bear wasn't protecting a kill. She wasn't warning them away. She was exhausted, wounded, and somehow, impossibly, seeking help. The others hadn't yet grasped what she did. Sarah let out a quiet whimper, instinctively stepping backward. "Clara, please, we can't." "She's not going to hurt us," Clara interrupted, her voice soft but firm. Her hands trembled slightly as she slowly lowered herself into a crouch, making herself smaller, less of a threat. The bear watched her, nostrils flaring, assessing. For a moment, neither moved. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the bear took a tentative step forward. Clara remained still, barely daring to breathe. The bear hesitated, then took another step, and another, closing the distance between them with slow, careful movements. Michael cursed under his breath. The rest of the group stood rigid, torn between fear and disbelief. Then, with a deep, guttural sigh, the mother bear lowered her head and released the cub at Clara's feet. A stunned silence fell over the clearing. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs as she stared at the small, unmoving bundle before her. She could hear her friends shifting behind her, their breaths coming in uneven bursts of panic, but she didn't turn. All her focus was on the cub. With excruciating slowness, Clara reached out, her fingers barely grazing the little body. It was still warm. A faint tremor ran through its tiny frame. It was alive. She swallowed hard, instincts kicking in. Years of studying wildlife, of working in conservation and animal rehabilitation, had prepared her for many things, but never for this. A mother bear, entrusting her with her young, seeking human aid. Clara's fingers found the cub's side, pressing gently. A weak, shuddering breath escaped its nose. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. The cub was barely hanging on. She needed to act fast. She fumbled for her pack, pulling out the emergency medical kit she always carried. Every movement had to be slow, deliberate, as hope. With careful hands, Clara wiped away the dirt and dried blood, searching for wounds. A deep gash ran along the cub's side, likely from a fall or a predator's attack. Her fingers moved with steady precision, cleaning the wound as best as she could with antiseptic wipes. The cub whimpered weakly, its small body flinching at the touch. The sound made the mother bear shift, a low rumble escaping her throat. Clara paused, lifting her gaze. "I'm helping," she murmured, voice calm, steady. "I promise." The bear's ears twitched. She didn't back away, didn't make a move to stop her. Behind her, someone muttered, "I can't believe this is happening." Clara pressed a bandage to the cub's wound, securing it with gentle hands. It wasn't much, but it was all she could do here. The cub needed real treatment, more than she could provide in the middle of the forest. As she sat back on her heels, the mother bear took another step forward. Clara tensed, though she didn't feel fear. Slowly, the bear lowered herself onto her haunches, wincing as her injured leg trembled under her weight. It was then that Clara noticed the deep gash on the bear's shoulder, a wound that had gone untreated, festering beneath her thick fur. The realization struck her hard. This bear had sought them out. She had brought her cub, offered it up, not just out of desperation, but trust. A silent plea for help, not only for her baby, but for herself. Clara's fingers tightened around the medical kit. She could walk away now, leave before the situation escalated, let the Rangers handle it. Or she could do what she knew deep in her bones was right. Taking a slow, steady breath, Clara inched closer. The mother bear's heavy gaze followed her, a flicker of recognition in those amber depths. Clara hesitated, then, with infinite care, reached out, her fingers grazing the matted fur near the wound. The bear didn't flinch, didn't growl, didn't move. It was the ultimate test of trust, and Clara wasn't about to fail it. The forest held its breath as Clara reached for the injured bear, her fingers brushing against the thick, matted fur caked with dried blood. The wound ran deep along the mother bear's shoulder, jagged and swollen with infection. It must have been painful, yet the bear remained still, watching her with those weary golden eyes. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. Every instinct screamed that this was a moment few humans would ever experience. To touch a wild grizzly not out of fear or aggression, but out of something far rarer, trust. Her friend stood, frozen behind her, too terrified to move, too mesmerized to look away. Michael's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Clara, please, you don't have to do this." But she knew she did. She couldn't walk away now, not after what the bear had done. Carefully, Clara opened her medical kit with deliberate, slow movements, mindful not to startle the mother bear. The antiseptic swabs, the bandages, the tools, all were standard for field work, yet never in her career had she imagined using them on a grizzly. She reached for a sterile cloth, dampened it with disinfectant, and lifted it toward the wound. The mother bear let out a soft, huffing breath but did not recoil. That was all the permission Clara needed. Gently, she dabbed at the injury, wiping away the dried blood and dirt that had collected around the torn skin. The wound twitched beneath her touch, a shudder rolling through the bear's massive body. Clara murmured softly, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I know it hurts. I'm sorry. Just hold on." The cub, still weak but stirring slightly, let out a faint, pitiful whimper at Clara's feet. At the sound, the mother bear turned her head slightly, ears flicking back in concern. Clara used the distraction to work faster, knowing that any moment, the fragile peace between them could be shattered. With careful hands, she applied an antibiotic ointment over the wound, smoothing it into the ragged edges of the gash. She wished she had proper veterinary tools, sutures, anything that could truly help, but this would have to do. When she pressed a bandage against the wound, the bear tensed, a low growl reverberating in her throat. Clara froze, fingers barely hovering over the fur. The growl was not a threat, but a warning, instinctual, involuntary. "I know," Clara whispered. "I'm almost done." The bear's breathing steadied, her muscles relaxing once more. Clara secured the bandage as best she could, patting it lightly to ensure it held. Then slowly, she pulled her hands away. The bear exhaled a long breath, the tension in her frame melting away. The relief in her eyes was unmistakable. Clara sat back on her heels, her own breath shaking in her chest. The reality of what had just happened crashed over her. She had treated a wild grizzly, had touched her, had helped her, ears perking, her body tensing as if preparing for flight. Clara turned sharply, her heart plummeting. Park rangers, 3 of them, moving cautiously but with purpose, their hands resting near their tranquilizer rifles. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, spoke first. "Step back, miss. We'll handle it from here." "No," Clara said immediately, rising to her feet but keeping her body relaxed, non-threatening. "She's calm. She's not a threat." The ranger frowned, his eyes flicking from her to the bear, skepticism clear in his expression. "That's a wild grizzly, ma'am, and she's injured. We need to sedate her before she lashes out." Clara shook her head. "She won't." She glanced at the bear, who had shifted slightly, her gaze darting between the newcomers and her cub, who whimpered again at the sudden change in atmosphere. The mother bear lowered her head, letting out a soft, warning huff. "Please," Clara said, her voice steady but urgent. "She's already weak. If you sedate her now, you could kill her." The ranger hesitated, clearly weighing the risk. One of his colleagues, a woman with a tense expression, murmured, "Sir, we can't just stand here. The cub needs medical attention too." That at least was something Clara could agree on. She gestured to the small bundle at her feet. "Let me help. I treated the mother. I can stay close. Keep her calm while you transport them. If she sees me, she won't panic." The older ranger exhaled through his nose, his grip loosening on his rifle. "You're a conservationist, aren't you?" Clara nodded. "Wildlife rescue. I know how this works. Just let me do this." The ranger exchanged glances with his team, then finally gave a curt nod. "Fine, but you stay close. Any sign of aggression, and we step in." Clara turned back to the mother bear. She could sense the tension in her, the unease settling over the moment like a thick fog. Carefully, she crouched again, murmuring softly, "It's okay. I won't leave you." The mother bear's breathing slowed. Her amber eyes met Clara's, and something passed between them, an understanding, fragile but unbreakable. As the rangers moved in, carrying a thick, padded transport cage, the bear let out a low, tired rumble but did not resist. Clara reached out one last time, fingers brushing against the bear's fur in a silent farewell. The bond between them, formed in pain and trust, would not be forgotten. The sedation was mild, just enough to lull the mother bear into a state of deep calm. Clara kept her hand against the bear's side as the rangers carefully loaded her into the transport unit. The cub was bundled in a separate, heated crate, his tiny chest rising and falling with shallow but steady breaths. Clara climbed into the transport vehicle beside them, her heart aching with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. This wasn't over, not yet. As the vehicle rumbled to life, heading toward the rehabilitation center miles away, Clara stole one last glance at the wilderness outside. The trees blurred past, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. She had come here for a simple hiking trip, expecting nothing more than the usual beauty of Yellowstone. Instead, she had found something extraordinary, a connection that defied logic, an unspoken language between species. She didn't know what the future held for the bear and her cub, but one thing was certain: Clara would be there. Every step of the way. The hum of the transport vehicle filled the air, a steady vibration beneath Clara's fingertips as she kept her hand gently pressed against the metal crate housing the mother bear. Though sedated, the great animal's body still rose and fell with deep, measured breaths, her massive frame curled awkwardly in the confined space. In the second crate, the cub lay nestled in a bundle of heated blankets, its tiny chest fluttering with the shallow rhythm of sleep. Clara exhaled slowly, the weight of the last few hours pressing down on her like an unseen force. Her friends had remained behind, too shaken by the encounter to insist on coming along, but she hadn't hesitated. The moment the rangers agreed to take the bears in for treatment, she knew she couldn't leave them. The trust between her and the mother bear, Sienna as Clara had begun calling her in her mind, felt too profound to abandon now. The ranger sitting across from her, the same graying man who had initially questioned her, shifted slightly, studying her with the quiet scrutiny of someone who had seen too much to be easily impressed. "You really know what you're doing, don't you?" he finally said, his voice carrying above the low drone of the engine. Clara glanced at him, offering a small, weary smile. "I've spent my life studying wildlife," she replied. "But this was different. The way she did with you. That kind of trust doesn't happen overnight." He leaned back against the seat, crossing his arms. "And it sure as hell doesn't happen with humans." Clara turned her gaze back to Sienna's crate. "I don't think she had a choice," she murmured. She was desperate. She knew she couldn't help her cub on her own. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. How many other animals in the wild suffered in silence, never daring to approach humans for help, their instincts warning them that to do so meant danger? What had driven Sienna to override that fear? The truck rumbled over a rough patch of road, jostling the crate slightly. The cub let out a faint whimper from its enclosure, its tiny paws twitching in response. Clara reached through the bars carefully, brushing her fingers against the warm fur of the blanket. The cub quieted at her touch, its breathing steadying. A flicker of emotion tightened her throat. This little one had been so close to death, limp and unresponsive, when his mother had carried him to her feet. If she had hesitated, if she had chosen fear over instinct, would the cub have survived? The rehabilitation center came into view just as the last light of day faded beyond the mountains. The facility, nestled within a protected stretch of wilderness, was modest in size but well-equipped, its staff dedicated to nursing injured wildlife back to health. As soon as the vehicle rolled to a stop, the team was already waiting. The doors swung open, and a flurry of activity erupted around them. Veterinarians in khaki uniforms rushed forward, swiftly assessing the state of the animals. Clara stepped out of the truck, her muscles stiff from the long ride, but she ignored the ache in her limbs as she followed closely behind. The cub was taken in first, carefully lifted from the crate and carried into the examination room. Clara lingered, torn between staying with him and ensuring Sienna was moved safely. The mother bear was handled with delicate precision, her unconscious body transported to a separate enclosure designed for large predators. The sedation was beginning to wear off, her massive paws twitching slightly as she was laid down on a thick bed of straw. A vet named Dr. Lillian Park turned to Clara, her expression sharp but not unkind. "You were with them when they were found?" she asked. Clara nodded. "The mother brought the cub to me. I treated their wounds in the field, but they need more care than I could give." Dr. Park studied her, then nodded approvingly. "You did good. Not many people would have had the nerve to do what you did." She motioned toward the cub. "He's weak, but he's fighting. If he responds well to fluids and treatment, he should recover." Clara's shoulders sagged with relief. "And the mother?" The vet hesitated. "She's tougher. The wound on her shoulder is deep, but what worries me more is her overall condition. She's malnourished, likely struggling to find enough food before she was injured. If she doesn't regain her strength, she won't be able to produce enough milk for the cub." Clara's heart clenched. "What can we do?" Dr. Park sighed, pushing a hand through her dark hair. "For now, we monitor her, provide supplemental feeding if necessary. If she doesn't improve, we'll have to consider long-term care options." Clara understood what she meant. If Sienna couldn't recover fully, releasing her back into the wild wouldn't be an option. The thought made her stomach twist. She had promised herself that this wasn't where their story ended, that Sienna and her cub would return home. She refused to believe otherwise. Days blurred together in a cycle of treatment and observation. Clara rarely left the facility, dedicating herself to assisting the veterinary team however she could. The cub, whom she had started calling Aspen, showed remarkable improvement within the first week. With each passing day, his tiny body grew stronger, his once fragile whimpers turning into playful growls as he batted at the blankets in his enclosure. Sienna, however, remained a battle of uncertainty. Though she ate, it was not enough. Her energy slowed to return. Clara spent hours sitting near her enclosure, speaking softly even when the bear seemed barely aware of her presence. She couldn't explain why, but she felt that Sienna needed to hear her voice, needed to know she wasn't alone. One evening, as Clara sat cross-legged just beyond the enclosure's reinforced bars, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. Slowly, Sienna lifted her head, those golden eyes blinking sluggishly before locking onto Clara's. The moment stretched between them, quiet and unspoken. Then with effort, Sienna shifted her massive body, her injured shoulder trembling under the weight. Clara held her breath as the bear, ever so slowly, pulled herself upright. "That's the most movement she's made in days," she murmured. Clara barely heard her. All she could focus on was the slow but determined steps as Sienna moved toward the edge of the enclosure. She stopped just inches from the bars, nostrils flaring as she took in Clara's scent. Then, in an action that nearly knocked the breath from Clara's lungs, Sienna lowered her massive head and let out a low, rumbling breath. Not a growl, not a warning. Something else, something softer. Clara didn't dare move. Tears pricked at her eyes, a swell of emotion rising in her chest. This wasn't submission, it wasn't dependence, it was recognition. A silent acknowledgement of the trust that had formed between them. A bond that went beyond human and beast, beyond logic or reason. Clara exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to be okay." Sienna blinked slowly. Then, as if she understood, she let out a long breath and lay down once more. But this time, for the first time, she didn't turn away. She stayed, eyes open, watching Clara in the fading light. The first rays of dawn filtered through the trees outside the rehabilitation center, casting golden streaks of light across the quiet enclosures. Clara sat with her back against the reinforced bars of Sienna's pen, exhaustion weighing on her limbs, but she refused to move. The mother bear had spent the night in a restless state, shifting and groaning in her sleep, her body still recovering from injury and malnourishment. But there was progress. She was eating more now, moving with slightly more strength, even if each step was slow and deliberate. The cub, Aspen, was thriving in his own way, growing more energetic by the day. His once frail whimpers had turned into playful squeaks, his little paws swiping curiously at the blankets in his enclosure. It gave Clara hope, something she had clung to since the moment Sienna had entrusted her with his fragile life. Dr. Park approached, her clipboard tucked under one arm, eyes flicking toward the bare enclosure before settling on Clara. "You're still here," she observed, not unkindly. Clara rubbed at her tired eyes and exhaled. "I don't want her to feel alone," she admitted, glancing over her shoulder at Sienna, who lay stretched out but awake, her golden eyes half-lidded as she listened to their conversation. "I think she's getting better," Clara continued, forcing herself to sound hopeful, though worry still gnawed at the edges of her resolve. Dr. Park sighed, tapping her pen absently against the clipboard. "She is," she agreed, "but it's slow. We'll need to continue supplementing her diet, making sure she's gaining enough strength to care for Aspen once they're released." Clara turned fully now, resting a hand lightly against the metal bars. "And you think they will be?" The question was quiet, but heavy with meaning. Dr. Park hesitated, and that brief pause made Clara's stomach twist. "I want to believe so," the vet finally said, "but there are no guarantees. If she can't regain full mobility, if she doesn't produce enough milk, we may have to reconsider options." Clara swallowed hard. "Captivity?" she asked, barely able to force the word out. Dr. Park nodded. "A sanctuary, perhaps, somewhere safe, but it's too early to say. Let's focus on getting her well first." Clara's fingers curled into fists against the cool metal, frustration tightening in her chest. She understood the logic, the science behind it all, but her heart rejected the idea. Sienna wasn't meant for a cage, no matter how humane. She was a creature of the wild, of towering pines and endless rivers. She deserved to go home. A small chirping sound broke through Clara's thoughts, and she turned to see Aspen attempting to climb the short wooden log placed in his pen. His tiny claws scratched against the surface, his back legs pushing off the ground in a determined but clumsy effort. Clara smiled despite herself, watching as he tumbled backward onto the soft blankets. He let out an indignant huff but scrambled back up, ready to try again. "He's getting stronger," she murmured. Dr. Park nodded, a touch of admiration in her voice. "He's a fighter, that's for sure, but without his mother, he wouldn't stand a chance in the wild." Clara looked back at Sienna, who had turned her head slightly, her eyes locked onto her cub's enclosure. Even in her weakened state, she was aware, watching, yearning. Clara stood abruptly, dusting off her jeans. "Then we have to make sure she's strong enough for him," she said firmly, "whatever it takes." Over the next several weeks, Sienna's condition steadily improved. Clara was there for every milestone, from the first time the mother bear stood without faltering to the moment she took her first cautious steps around the enclosure. There was a rhythm to their bond now, something unspoken but undeniable. Sienna no longer stiffened when Clara entered the observation area. She no longer flinched when their eyes met. Trust had been fragile at first, but it had deepened into something real. Aspen, on the other hand, had become a whirlwind of energy. His coordination improved, his playful nature growing bolder. He pounced at imaginary prey, tested his tiny teeth against the logs, and began to recognize Clara's voice, perking up whenever she spoke. It was easy to forget how close to death he had been, how still he had lain in his mother's jaws that day in the forest. Now he was thriving, and that meant everything. One evening, Clara found herself in the observation area, watching Sienna eat from the prepared meal of fish and berries. The golden light of the setting sun bathed her fur in a warm glow, and for the first time, Clara saw something return to the bear's posture: strength, dignity, the wild nature that had been dulled by pain, but never truly lost. Dr. Park approached, this time without her usual clipboard. "We have a date," she said simply. Clara turned, eyes widening. "For release?" The vet nodded. 2 weeks. We'll move them to a remote area of the park, far from human trails. They'll be monitored for a while, just to ensure they're adjusting. But if all goes well, they'll be free. Clara felt a rush of relief so intense that she nearly laughed, but the sound came out as a shaky exhale. She turned back to Sienna, who had lifted her head, ears twitching as if sensing the shift in energy. "You hear that?" Clara murmured. "You're going home." The days leading up to the release were a whirlwind of preparation. Sienna's tracking collar was fitted, a necessary precaution to ensure her safety and adaptation. The final medical checks were conducted, confirming that she was strong enough to survive on her own. Through it all, Clara felt an increasing weight in her chest, a strange mixture of joy and sorrow. She had spent so much time with these bears, had built something rare and irreplaceable. Letting go wouldn't be easy. The morning of the release arrived crisp and clear, the sky a vast stretch of blue over the mountains. Clara rode in the transport vehicle alongside the rangers, Sienna's crate secured in the back, Aspen's smaller enclosure beside her. The journey was long, winding deep into the untouched parts of Yellowstone, where rivers carved through valleys and towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. When they arrived at the release site, the moment felt surreal. The enclosures were carefully opened, the metal doors swinging outward. There was a pause, a stillness, and then Sienna stepped forward, her nose lifting to take in the scent of home. Clara held her breath. The mother bear hesitated only a moment before moving forward with slow, deliberate steps. Aspen followed, scampering after her on wobbly legs. Clara watched as they disappeared into the trees, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and longing. Sienna paused once at the edge of the clearing, turning slightly, her golden eyes locking onto Clara's one last time. It lasted only a moment, a breath, and then she was gone. Clara exhaled, a small, bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. They were where they belonged, and that was enough. The forest swallowed them, and Clara stood motionless, her breath caught in her chest as the last traces of Sienna and Aspen disappeared into the wild. The trees rustled in their wake, a final whisper of farewell before silence reclaimed the clearing. The rangers murmured among themselves, satisfied with the smooth release, but Clara barely heard them. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her jacket, resisting the urge to chase after them, to call them back, to linger in the space where trust had been built and now severed by the simple, inevitable force of nature, reclaiming its own. She had always known this moment would come. She had fought for it. Yet watching them leave, watching that golden coat slip beyond the horizon, felt like losing a piece of herself. Dr. Park approached, her boots crunching softly against the earth. "That was textbook perfect," she said, her voice gentle. "She didn't hesitate. That means she's ready." Clara nodded, swallowing the lump forming in her throat. "Yeah," she managed, forcing a breath out through her nose. "She's ready." The vet studied her for a moment, then offered a knowing smile. "You can stay for a while if you need to," she said before walking off to help the Rangers pack up the remaining equipment. Clara let out a shaky exhale, her eyes fixed on the tree line where Sienna had disappeared. The foolish part of her wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she would. Minutes passed, then an hour. The team finished their work and began loading up the transport vehicles. Clara remained rooted in place, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, reliving every moment from the day she first met Sienna to now. The weight of it settled deep in her bones. She had spent weeks watching over them, earning their trust, proving herself as more than just another human intruder in their world. And now, just like that, it was over. A breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it the crisp scent of pine and damp earth. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in. When she opened them again, the last of the Rangers were climbing into their vehicles. Dr. Park leaned out of the passenger window. "You sure you don't want to ride back?" Clara shook her head. "I think I'll hike a bit before heading in." The vet gave her an understanding nod. "Take care, Clara." The engine rumbled to life, and one by one, the vehicles rolled away, their tracks blending into the uneven ground until they were nothing more than distant specks against the vast wilderness. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara turned in a slow circle, taking in the untouched land around her. This was where Sienna and Aspen would begin again, where their lives would unfold beyond human interference. The thought should have comforted her, but it only deepened the ache in her chest. She had never felt this kind of connection before. Not to an animal, not even to another person. It was something sacred, something rare, and now it existed only in memory. She took a deep breath and adjusted the straps on her backpack. She had promised herself she wouldn't linger too long, but as her feet carried her forward, she realized she wasn't quite ready to leave. The instinct that had guided her all along, one she couldn't fully explain, urged her to follow, just for a little while, to see the world through Sienna's eyes one last time. The terrain was rugged but familiar, the scent of fresh earth mingling with the crisp mountain air. Clara moved quietly, her boots barely making a sound as she traced the faintest signs of their passing. Bent grass, the whisper of disturbed foliage. She wasn't trying to track them, not really. She simply wanted to feel their presence a little longer, to assure herself they were safe. An hour passed, then another. The sun had begun its descent, bathing the trees in a golden glow, when she finally spotted something ahead. A disturbance in the underbrush, a familiar shape shifting in the distance. Clara froze, her breath hitching. Sienna. The bear stood at the edge of a shallow stream, her massive frame illuminated by the soft light filtering through the trees. Aspen stood beside her, playfully pawing at the water, sending tiny ripples dancing across the surface. Clara didn't dare move, afraid that even the smallest sound would shatter the delicate moment. But as she stood there, something remarkable happened. Sienna turned. Her golden eyes met Clara's across the clearing, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. It wasn't fear or wariness in her gaze. It was something deeper, something that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. Recognition, a silent acknowledgement of what had passed between them, of what had been given and what had been lost. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, even if she knew the words would be meaningless. But she didn't have to. Sienna had already understood. The bear held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to the water, nudging Aspen gently forward. The cub let out a playful chuff before bounding toward the riverbank, his little body moving with new confidence. Clara watched them go, her heart swelling with a strange mixture of sorrow and joy. This was where they belonged, where they had always belonged. And for the first time since their release, She truly believed they would be okay. A tear slipped down her cheek, though she wasn't sure if it was from sadness or relief. Maybe both. She took a slow step back, then another. Sienna didn't turn again, didn't hesitate. The message was clear. It was time to let go. Clara exhaled and finally did. By the time she made it back to the main trail, the last light of day had faded, leaving only the glow of the moon above the towering pines. The weight in her chest had lessened, replaced with something lighter, something almost peaceful. She had done what she had set out to do. She had fought for them, cared for them, walked beside them for as long as she was meant to, and now the wild had reclaimed them. She knew she would return to this place, to this work, to the endless fight for creatures like Sienna and Aspen. Because in the end, this wasn't just their story, it was hers too, and it always would be.